if there are key folks that you want to bring along, bring them into the process with you as if they were part of your product team.
Okay, I think we'll just give it a couple more minutes. Looks like we have a couple of people from, or one person from Texas. Where's everyone else from? And another from Illinois. Welcome, welcome. From NC, North Carolina, I guess. I'm from Toronto, Canada, so bear with me if I don't know all the American acronyms for states. See another fellow Canadian from Vancouver. Hello, NYC, Colorado. This is awesome.
Another Toronto person as well.
Oh, nice. Now I don't feel alone.
Awesome, lots of fun. I'm in Boston, so I haven't seen any Boston folks just yet, but I do see a lot of East Coast folks, so that's cool.
All right. Let's see. And then just so everyone is aware, there's a couple of different areas where you can have, you can start chats. So make sure when you're on the right-hand panel, you're clicking on sessions and putting in sort of your comments, feedback, and questions there. There's also the option of clicking on events. We're not currently checking that at the moment. So if you have a question, if you have comments, please put them into the session chat. Okay, great. Lots of people joining. This is awesome. Hey. Yes, another great activity that you can do while we're waiting is updating your profile. So if you see on the top right corner, there is the profile. You can click on that downwards arrow. You can click to edit, add in maybe your LinkedIn, add in where you're from, what you're doing. And then people, when they're talking to you, can get to know you a little bit more. And then it's easier to also connect with one another if you'd like to chat later. Okay, so I think we could maybe get started. I see there's 36 people in the room. That's great. So I'm really excited today to present our speaker, Cristina Fernandez. She's a seasoned product leader, and she comes from a wealth of experience across various different industries and background. So I'll pass the mic to Cristina so she can talk a little bit more about what she's teaching here and a little bit about her background. So Cristina, off to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to start, I'll do the background in a second, but I'm actually going to start with kind of like the storyline, and then we'll kind of go into the idea. But today, really the goal is to think about how to pivot your team, and then more than that, how to use this as a chance to build trust and collaboration with the team. Because I think that this is a really tough thing. A lot of times people on a team, and I'm sure everyone's experienced this in here, will feel like stuff comes top down, do this new thing. We don't really know what's going on. You don't feel super engaged. And one of the things I've seen work really well over time is including the whole team in the process. And then even though that seems very onerous, the outcome here can be very positive. So some of the things that will often lead to this are big slowdowns. This happened to us, not necessarily in 2008, but when we were at Wayfair, the unexpected challenges in COVID. Maybe this means like your business needs to react and change what you're working on. I think I've seen this also at startups that I've worked for. When you're trying to hockey stick, go from niche market to mass market, you're actually seeing, especially on the product side, a need to potentially change what you're working on. And so in all of these cases, there's different reasons, there's different goals, but it can create a lot of uncertainty. And you can actually use this as a leader of your team to kind of refocus the team, adapt through these, and then actually build a stronger relationship between folks, but then also back with the leadership of like, hey, like this team can pivot, is resilient, and kind of like can respond to changing times. So those are sort of like where I'm thinking of. A little bit about myself. I'm currently a PM at Meta on our data platform team. I've been a data platform PM for the last 2.5, give or take, years, but most of my experience up until now has been user facing. And I've worked across e-commerce, so that's most recently at Wayfair, developer tools, B2B, enterprise, so very, very different, at GitHub, and very different like product management environment where it's very technical, working very closely with the engineers. Health tech, a company called Council that was later acquired. But in this is, both GitHub and Council were like bigger startups that were trying to kind of do that hockey stick growth. So have that experience there. And then started my career at Facebook. So before it was Meta. And I think before we'd acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, and really got my initial tech training there doing straight up growth, really focused on Latin America. I'm fluent in Spanish. So it was a great opportunity to just kind of like figure out how we win and grow in Latin America versus some of the other markets. And my very first career, so I consider tech my second career. My first career was as a chemist, where I did a lot of drug development here in Boston for malaria research, as well as for breast cancer stem cells. So it was really cool times, and I actually loved being in tech. I see a lot of overlap between being a chemist and being a product manager. So, and just for some things about myself, I love to swim, love to dance, love to paint. These things change a little bit. I think like a few years ago, this list might have been different, but that's sort of like what's at the top of my list right now in terms of what I like to do for fun. Awesome. I was just checking out the chat to see if there were any questions. I think that like the most important thing for a product manager, for any team, is to recognize the need to or opportunity to pivot. And I really think in a lot of cases, it is an opportunity that's in response to the need. And I think that teams can be slow to do this because change is really scary. What if we don't know what we're working on? What if it's not the right thing? We've been doing something for a long time, potentially, especially at like a bigger company like Meta. Like our team and Wayfair, where your teams have very standard roles and you've been doing them for many, many years as a team. And so there's kind of like this understanding in the organization about that. But there's things that kind of will drive the necessity. There's new company priorities. And the question that I always ask myself when I feel things are changing in the company is, could our team be doing more to meet these new priorities, whatever they are? Like, is it shifting from revenue to something else? Is it shifting from growth to revenue? Like, what is sort of like the focus? And are we directly impacting that? There's also market challenges. And this is sort of where you see kind of like the business challenges is like, is the business suffering? Is there something that you can really make an impact on? Do your team's core competencies help with this? They might not always, but it's worth asking that question. And then if everything's wonderful and you're not having a challenging time and nothing is changing in that way, like thinking about the future, how do you grow your team scope? Is there adjacent product opportunity to expand your team, add more value, drive like existing priorities? So I think like all of these are opportunities to pivot. So one of the questions I had, I wanted to do maybe a chat prompt here. I was like, are you experiencing any of these or do you see any of these? I think it's similar to what Polly had asked at the beginning, just to get everyone thinking about like how this could relate to you. And maybe if there's anyone who wants to kind of come in and share what they're experiencing, would love to hear from you all. And I can see like entering new market is a good example. Absolutely. Digital transformation. Oh, shifting from sales led to product led. That's huge. I mean, I think that's maybe even like that's a whole organizational shift, change and focus change. Those are really big things. Layoffs, reorg. Yeah, all of those sound really familiar. Thanks for sharing. I think like this will all, and definitely feel free to break in with questions. Polly's gonna check for questions as we kind of go through. Happy to be interrupted. So I think some of the key steps for you as the product lead or the team lead or kind of like different roles here is to understand the changing environment, formulate your own opinion, understand who you need. Like this part's huge. Like who of anything is really important. And then the number 4 is I think where I've seen the most value to building team cohesion, which is like bringing everyone on your team along and then sharing back with leadership for confirmation. And I think this could depend, how you do this depends a lot the way your company works. So I think at a lot of the companies I've been at, there's a lot more bottom up input. So if that's not something that's natural in your org, you might like change the order of some of these steps, but I think the steps are roughly the same. So we're going to go into each of them. In terms of understanding the changing environment, I think like the first thing is to understand what's changing, why is it changing, and one of the ways you can do this, I put in number 3, is you can read through company updates, and watch all hands, listen to quarterly reports if you're a public company. These are actually really huge. It gives you a lot of indication for the strategic direction of a company. And as a product manager at any level, strategic direction is important for you to understand how to align with that. Because if you're not, and you can do some steps to confirm. You can ask your manager, you can talk to other folks, are you interpreting things correctly, and kind of build group knowledge around what these changes are and confirming, hey, we think these are the 5 changes, or these are the things we think are happening. And then when you think about your team specifically, I think there's an assessment period of like, is there a gap between what your team is doing and what might be needed? And this could be proactively, like before a reorg, or in response to a reorg. Like, hey, we're on a new team, we have a new set of people, like what are our core competencies and what are the things we expected to do? I think that like with e-commerce or social or different things like that, you're often thinking about growth and revenue, but that might be different, right? Like if you're a sales-led company, it might be how the sales team, like the NPS, or there could be different kind of metrics that the company is working towards. And so find sort of like what's changing, is it a changing focus, and then how your team relates to that and what's the gap, and just kind of like that understand phase. This could take like a day or 2, or it could take weeks, kind of depending on where you are and how quickly things are changing. All right, so I think that the other key thing is to kind of formulate your own opinion, because as the product lead, like you want to bring everyone else along, but this first step is for you to understand where you want to get to. What's the North Star? We're at A, and the really concrete example I can give maybe is from Wayfair, where we this was like really right prior to the first layoff a few years ago. The company was not doing great, and then our team was on the navigation side, and one of my teams was very focused on notifications account, because identity had been a big part of what we were thinking about. But with revenue being a big focus, none of the things that team was doing were driving revenue. And it could be really sensitive to say, at that point, I was leading a team of like 60 or 70 folks overall. It could be really sensitive to say, hey, like what this team is working on no longer makes sense based on the priorities. But honestly, like your team already knows this. They're listening to the stuff. They get this, they have like everyone has this vibe of like, hey, things don't feel right. What are we really working on? And so I think like the first step was for me and a couple of the other leads to say, we think that we might have to shift away from this. How do we do that? Right? We think that this is not the best way to spend the time of this group of people. But how do we go through that process? And that's the most concrete example I can think of actually like shifting the full team. And so I think that like, this is where that first step is. Like you have your own opinion. You might want to start like, but kind of like shopping it around to an increasing group of people. So maybe you can start with your manager. If the trust is there, your engineering partners, your design partners, really think of like your core XFN. If you're running one product team, it should be like the 2 or 3 people you talk to every day, who's your tech lead, your manager, that kind of like maybe like a really important partner who has an opinion, depends on the org structure. And then start shopping it around with them, getting feedback. Do they see the same trends? Do they have the same kind of like vision of where it could go? And like build that muscle with a smaller group. And I think that's super important to get their buy-in, and then ask what their concerns are, right? Like where, and in this case of Wayfair, like our engineering partners were really concerned that the engineer, because on the product side, there was only 1 PM on that team. So it was easy to talk to her and see where she was at, but there was a team of engineers. What was their focus? What would they work on instead? And there was a lot of care for the people involved, and our engineering partners felt that was important to keep front and center. So you can kind of start to understand what matters to the team, to figure out who you partner with to bring everybody along. And then there's the process of actually bringing everyone along. The way that we did this in the Wayfair use case was we actually, the smaller group, so the group of PMs and our EM partners and the design partners and a couple of folks actually put together an entire deck of like the trends that we were seeing, the changes, the new goals. And then we actually asked every single engineering team and every single engineer who was leading a project to do a pitch for how their work may or may not map up to those new goals. And then we actually had a team-wide, so like this was like 70, 80 people milling around the room, voting on all of the projects for the reprioritization. And what was interesting is that like from this, we self-voted to the point where most of the projects that were on this other team were not aligned with like the core goals. But the whole team was a part of it. Like the leads were part of sharing like the changing trends. The whole team was a part of understanding it. And even like people on the team were voting for projects on other teams, right? In terms of like what was most important and what best aligned. So it was really, really powerful experience. And hold on, I see.
Yeah, we do have a question from Molly here about the finance team and maybe tagging to that, like sometimes there's legal risk and compliance that also have to be. So Christine, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I saw that question. I think that like, this is sort of why this step is so important, right? I think in the Wayfair case, we were very focused on the product side because we had, because we didn't have necessarily like a finance approval needed or legal risks with some of the stuff we were kind of deprioritizing in terms of work. But what we did do in that case is like marketing was one of our really big partners. And we actually included them in this stage of the bring everybody along stage. So we involve them in the team-wide reprioritization. And I do this all the time when we're doing like vision building and brainstorms is like, if there are key folks that you want to bring along, bring them into the process with you as if they were part of your product team, right? Like I mean, in this case, I'm not sure how we think about finance. In most of the companies I'm in, they're pretty distant from the product work. But if the finance team is a really big part of like your road mapping and support and things like that, then absolutely you should bring them in. Either depending on every organization, you might bring them in at this stage to help you build the story and the process. Or you might kind of bring them along on the full team process. I think it depends on each organization. I think that hasn't been necessary where I've been, but that's one approach for finance. I don't know, Molly, if that answers your question, because I'm not sure exactly how this relates into your case, but we can talk about it as well in Q&A. There's another question about like with 70 people. I think that like this is sort of where actually you having a really strong opinion about where you want to land is important, right? So like we landed roughly where I thought we would land through this voting process, and where you have to set a lot of context with folks, right? Where you have to do sharing information, sharing trends, sharing those goals. I think it does dilute a little bit, but it's not so much that this is like the decision-making process. This isn't like, oh, we're making a decision, this voting will stand. You can override some of the decisions potentially if you think it's necessary, but it allows people to be a part of the process, understand the pros and cons. And like in this case, one team that was pretty siloed maybe didn't have the context about what the other 4 to 5 teams were working on. So they got context about what are the other opportunities, how do they compare to each other, and what you see when you trust your team in most cases is that you get to roughly the right place. And I think that like this may not work in every organization, but it's worked, I would say, in most places that I've worked in. And usually like the voting is not like, it's not like an election, right? It's a directional thing. You can share, hey, like 20 people voted for this, 5 people voted for that. Those 5 people might not get their thing chosen, but it's still something where like you can kind of see the general trend and build that alignment with the team. And yeah, to Amanda's point, I completely agree. It's about folks being heard. And if people disagree with your decision, it's much easier to do that when they understand your decision, and kind of get on board. And if you're thinking about like a reorg, what I've seen this work really well for is for the post reorg phase, right? Where you've changed the team dynamic when a pivot means a reorg, because not all pivots mean a reorg, right? It could mean a change in focus for the same group of people. But in this case, that was just sort of like the specific example. But it meant that like the people who are moved to other projects or other teams were able to really quickly bounce back and be excited about that work, because they understood why it was happening and the process. And I think one of my observations through a lot of this is that like even very junior folks know what's going on, understand, and trusting in them and believing in them. This is like very, very powerful to building a team dynamic of like transparency and trust, because it's like, oh, you believed that I would be enough of a partner to you to like include me in on this, right? Versus like the feeling of like, oh, you think you know better because of X, Y, and Z. So I think it's like a style of leadership that's more collaborative. Again, I don't know if it necessarily works everywhere, but I think you can tweak it to different places and different modes. Awesome. Okay, so I think when you share with leadership, and I think this step is interesting because I think you can do this at any stage or at all of the stages. So it's not necessarily do everything and then at the end share. You can be really open with each step. So in the Wayfair case, or I'll use some other examples at Facebook or in other places, when we wanted to update our strategy, so not even like a hard pivot or reorg, what we were able to do is actually share the brainstorm results, and say, hey, here were the trends that we came up with. Based on this, we're going to do this. And then kind of like sharing each step. I think I've seen a lot of ideas about like PMing in public. And I think there's a couple of different ways to kind of follow through with this. But again, I think this depends on your organizational structure, how much trust there is, like how much bottom up voice you have and control that you have. In most of the places I've worked, there has been a fair amount of that, which is important. And then you can kind of like present it as a proposal, right? Like ask for alignment. Hey, here's the trends we're seeing. Here's sort of where we are. Like, do you agree? And I think that if the answer is no, you have a really awesome opportunity to say, oh, great. Like, why? And dig in and understand, because at the end of the day, as a product leader, you're leading your team towards a long-term vision, and you want to build that alignment with leadership, with partners, with other stakeholders, kind of like all of the piece of the puzzle. And if you're leading them in the wrong direction, like the sooner you know, the better. So it's important to like get from leadership, present enough information to leadership that you can get really, really good feedback to what you're thinking. And it could be, even going back to my point, you could kind of like at this step, understand the changing environment. You could do that with your leadership and say like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. These are the gaps. Like, do you agree? And they could say, yes, I agree, or no, I think you're fine. And you can kind of dig in from there. So you can kind of either wait to the end, or through each of these steps, kind of check in with your manager, with skips, in forums. I think like a lot of places have product reviews. And these are really helpful places to, I think people want a lot of those meetings to go really well. Like, hey, everyone's in love with it, and like, yes, and just a lot of agreement. But actually, I think if you can get out disagreement and present things in a way that you get clarity and guidance, that's the biggest win for me with the leadership conversations.
We do have a couple of questions on the side.
Yeah. Sure.
So one of them was, what kind of approach would work when we need to make an unpopular, tough decision, like sunsetting a project or a product which directly impacts the engineering team?
Yeah, I think that like it depends. You can use parts of this process. It's hard for people to sunset their own projects that they've been like super involved in and excited about, and spent, maybe months to years on. And this happened to me recently. But I think that like one of the ways that I do this, and I'm trying to not be super specific on the actual project, but we recently had been working on an infrastructure project for like literally 18 months. And I worked on it for 18 months. So in some ways it was like my project as well. And what we heard from our partner was, hey, this isn't a priority. We're not going to like launch with this infrastructure right now. We'll get back to you on when. And I think that like the engineering team was like, no, like we have to save it. And it's not that like we're going to depreciate the whole project. So I don't know if this is quite exactly what the person was asking. But it was a hard decision to say like, hey, I think we should actually refocus on something else. Like in this case, it was like one or two people, one or two engineers, not like an entire team, not entire project. It wasn't the entire team's worth of projects. But it was an unpopular decision. But I think that like the argument that I was kind of saying was like, hey, like, do you want to work another 6 months on something that will never launch? Or do you want to stop now after 16 months, work on something else, and in 6 months have something to show for it? Because there's a lot of like business schools speak about like sunk costs and things like that. But sometimes it's actually the wrong decision to keep going for those people, for their career. And I think if you like ask them, like, what are you worried about? What's the concern that you have? Like getting at the what and the why of that difficult, like why they disagree, then you can kind of like start from there and build to the agreement. And sometimes you do just have to say like, hey, we're going to do the hard thing. It's hurtful to you as an individual. And here are the things we're going to do to mitigate that effect on you. And just accept it, because sometimes it is like the overall right decision is not great for an individual or a team. And I think that should be okay. And the organization can't be afraid to make those calls, because that actually hurts both the organization and the people involved even longer. Like if they're worried about their review cycle, you get to what's really bothering them. You can say like, well, imagine another review cycle where you didn't have anything to show for it. Like we're trying to like make sure that there's something to show for at the end.
Great answer. Sometimes I also find, even if you have to can a project, if you take the team and celebrate what you've learned, even though you aren't, promoting that to production, that could sometimes feel like a win. At least you're learning, you're taking away something from there.
Yeah,
I know we are close to the breakout time, but I think maybe we'll have time for one more question, and then we can move over to the next part. But the next question was, did you have team leaders parse the buckets of projects first and then align the goals and reprioritization principle? How did you make trade-off between goals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you can do that if you want to, like, if we go back to this section of like formulate your own opinion, I think you can go as deep as you want in this bucket. You can have like a general direction, North Star. You can actually draft what you think the team, if it's a reorg, could look like. If it's a smaller case where you're just working on a different kind of project, I think it really depends on the scale of what kind of change and pivot we're talking about. But I think that like letting people get through that process is important. So even if you have your own opinion, I would say like revealing it in steps versus like, here's what it is, like that's going to feel very different. So that's one thought there. And then in terms of like, how do you make trade-offs between the priorities and the goals? I think this is like such a personal answer for each team, but I'll give a concrete example. I think at Meta, one of the things we think about a lot on our team is like, what are we really good at doing? What is our core competency? And if like there's 5 company priorities, not trying to match all of them, but say, hey, we're going to like really, and this is like where the strategy part of your product makes like is important, where it's say, hey, we're really going to focus on A and B. And then like these 3 for the XYZ reasons, we're not going to focus on those things because we don't feel like we're the right team to move the needle there. And that may be an acceptable answer or not. I think it depends. But that's how I would approach the trade-offs, is really thinking, especially in times of change and scarcity and really difficult, like your team is what it is. Your people have the skills that they have, and you own the product areas that you own, right? So it's sort of like starting with the basic core competencies of what we can do as a team, and then which of the priorities can we best drive. And that's like the rough framework I would use, with the idea that like you can actually focus and get more things done with that focus, and potentially stop working on either things that don't, anything, not necessarily, but things that don't align with those couple of focus areas. We can move things around.
Great, thank you. So the other question, maybe we'll leave it for the end when we come back from our networking session. So Cristina, if you don't mind moving the slides over.
Yeah, go for it. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so now we're kind of going to go break out and do the networking portion of this event. So some of the prompts that you can sort of ask one another during these networking sessions are up there on your screen. What you'll need to do is on the left-hand panel, there is people. It's open now. So what you'll do is you'll click onto there and you will join, and you'll be automatically matched with somebody else in the mixer. And so when you click on join, it might take a few minutes for the program to automatically find you a match, but you'll be joined with somebody else. So you'll have 10 minutes per conversation with another partner. If you wish to extend it, you can do so within the chat. But before you end the chat, make sure that you exchange details so that if you want to connect with each other on LinkedIn, you can do so. But after 2 rounds, so a total of 20 minutes in the networking portion, please do remember to come back here. Watch on the top of your screen. There will be a message to let you know that the Blender portion is ending, and we're going to come back and we're going to finish up with some Q&A, because I know there is an additional question there that somebody had asked. So if you want to click over now to the people section, you can start mixing and mingling with some other people in this event.
Awesome. Thanks, Polly, for moderating. This has been great too.
Yeah, thank you for your insights. Okay. Let's see.
Hello.
Hello. I think we're just waiting for people to come back from the original event, but I am happy to open this up so that we can have some interesting little conversation here. So anyone have any highlights that they wanted to share, things they wanted to discuss?
It's been very timely. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry, is it Zainab? I didn't.
Yeah, Zainab.
Okay, yeah. Okay, cool. We were actually in a one-on-one together and found that we're almost in the same boat, both experiencing layoffs and in the same industry. And yeah, like the questions we both kind of had were, it's a lot of our effort is going towards making sure that we're continuing to motivate the team who is feeling the effects of the layoff, like low morale, worries about the workload, worries about changing priorities, and then also just trying to look ahead at how we can create a roadmap that kind of matches those challenges that we know that are out there. So it's just like a lot on our plates right now.
Well, I hope you guys were able to share some, tips that you have both used, and since you're in the same industry, maybe it can sort of be some sort of shared learning. Ooh. Anyone else have any pivots or big changes? I think somebody had said this was a very timely talk.
Oh yeah, it was starting to say I'm recently joined an organization, and next week I'm leading like one of their strategic planning meetings, one of their, I guess, regularly scheduled. I don't know how often these will happen, but an opportunity to kind of set priorities and align to value. And so this was really great input for me to think about. And some of the things that I've been trying to do, like bringing people into that conversation that might have been left out in the past. I think for me, the challenge is just really that the company doesn't have a really crisp set of priorities, and they don't have alignment. So they end up executing on a bunch of different priorities and then not knowing whether they're having an impact. So it's really bringing in some just kind of the basics of product culture almost into an operations setting. So I see a lot of things though that can help apply. And it's hearing about the bottom up decision making. There does tend to be more of a top down from some of the leaders. So this will be the first test of like, okay, how much room do we have to evolve and to build this together? So there seems to be openness and willingness, and then it'll be the, okay, how do we actually take this forward? So, but it's been helpful to look at it through this kind of a framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I find sometimes, if you are at a company where it's a lot of top down, it's like, okay, well, why don't we from top down? Yes, tell us what is the strategy, what is like those high level objectives, but then let the people at the bottom who are more familiar with the product and the ins and outs and the day to day come up with, okay, well, for that strategy, these are the projects or the product features or the things that we think could move the needle for those strategic objectives that we have. And so it's like, so that everyone feels that they're putting in something into the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I'm hopeful to get. Right. In the past, it has often been kind of handing down solutions of like, well, wouldn't this fix the problem, and not even really quantifying the problem and the impact. So it's a lot of shifting to be done. So we'll see.
Well, good luck. I know shifting is always hard. It's like an uphill battle, but you'll hit that peak, and then it'll just be roller coaster down.
That's what I'm hoping for.
We're having sort of
Anyone
an
else?
inverted moment of this to some degree at my organization, where our teams have been like extremely empowered and independent, but have become autonomous to the point of like total silos. Also coupled with like a really kind of broad product strategy that had us going in like way too many directions. And so now it's really interesting if we have a new organizational like business strategy that's very focused. The product strategy is pretty clear from there. And we want to retain the empowerment piece and the sort of like ground up prioritization and roadmap building. But we're trying to like create a new sort of structure that allows for like, that basically gets us out of that siloed, like every team's just sort of wild west. So it's interesting. It's like, I feel like for some people, it can feel like a lot of structure is about to be added to a very like fluid and organic process. But to those of us like on a management side or who are thinking more of strategy, I think it's like super tricky. It's been tricky to like understand what anybody else is doing. So,
yeah, we're in the same boat. Like there's been a little bit of a lack of focus across many teams. And now that they're trying to become more focused, our finance team has taken over our budgeting process and allocation. So if we're trying to do all of these things in order to get more headcount, and it kind of needs to be blessed by them in advance of being prioritized by our executive leadership. And I've never, people above me in the past have not cared at all about like how you're going to like get something done. But and then there was like an understanding that like the technology partners would dictate the type of infrastructure that was needed. But this is kind of a different way of doing it. And I'm trying to adapt like, oh gosh, I have a lack of control. I have to like influence without authority more than I've ever done in my life. I don't know if it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know if it's going to work out. But I'm going to show up every day and we're going to try our best.
That definitely sounds like a very interesting way, like a different approach. Yeah, good luck. I wonder if you can talk to the finance folks because, yes, you can kind of look at ROI on certain like product features or whatever you want to sink your efforts into, but there's some things that are not quantifiable by dollars.
Not
like
everything comes to
user
revenue,
happiness.
right? Yeah, unless you have the infrastructure there that allows you to go after the big fish, like you're not going to be able to say like, this infrastructure is going to make us money. It's the big fish that will make you money, but you have to build the infrastructure first. I think that's where it's getting tricky.
Yeah, I wonder if you can have like just like an open, frank conversation with them. Be like, how could I help you understand the value when it doesn't immediately translate into dollars, but eventually it will.
Yeah.
And that math is like very vague.
Soon.
Yeah.
Next week
we have
to meet the person and understand more.
We have that kind of a dynamic too, where I'm dealing with a lot of like, we need enabling technologies, So in order to build that capacity, this is the technology layer that will enable that, even though you're not having transactions flowing through it, but like it's getting that thinking of, okay, well, what do we want to be achieving? What's holding us back? And that could be from a technology standpoint. In my case, it could also be, what are the business processes holding us back? And like, no one's really looking at that. So I'm getting pulled into different things that aren't typically product, but that are all, holding us back from actually delivering. So,
but yeah, I don't know. How did all the like side sessions go for you all? I'd love to hear kind of like what people were talking about and what kind of pivots and changes were kind of top of mind. Or if there's any questions for me, either way, but I would love to hear kind of.
There was one question. I think Molly, you had a question earlier today that we didn't answer. So maybe I'll just backtrack and ask that. Or if you want to read it, you're welcome to read it as well.
Yeah, sure. So I have a boss that's really heavy in UI research, and she's done that for many years, and I'm not. So like, I'm more of like technical backend, like data type of person. And I'm also a chemist too, just FYI, which I thought was really cool.
There's a weird number of like chemists, chemical engineers in product. I don't know why, but I've met a lot.
Yeah, so like she's very into frameworks. So anything that we want to justify, you have to like go and get customer feedback. And we're sort of like a data team. So we have internal and client customers, and we're also in charge of the homepage. These two things to me don't make sense. Whatever. So when we do a framework, we have to take all of this feedback and then categorize it and say like, well, this is sort of like the complaint, and then this is kind of like the overarching like problem, like we're missing X or we need X to implement it in our environment. And then taking all of that, and then you apply another framework it's called like a reach confident. It's a RICE model. So it's like, how many people can you reach? What's the impact of the implementation? What's the confidence that you could get it done? And then how many people are you going to expect for it? And you do like add the first three together and divide by the fourth, and you score it all. Which when it comes to like infrastructure that we need, like a middleware layer that is sort of like a federated data access layer, it's really hard to like, there's a lot of value to things that you're not going to see an immediate sort of impact from. So like, and certain components go together. So the impact of one thing might be low, but you can't implement that other high impact thing without this low impact thing. So like a data dictionary is super important, right? Data governance, very important. Like you really have to go with that, even if you're not confident that you'll be able to implement those things, because it requires a lot of coordination across the organization. But you need it. So like I spend so much time on frameworks, and I'm like, is this what everyone's doing, or is this just me? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts. of varying maybe helpfulness. But I think like on the one frame, what I've started to do is translate the word framework to structure, because I think that's actually what it means. And so when someone says like, put that in a framework, what they're actually asking for is structure, right? Like they're saying like, hey, I don't know how this information relates to each other. And frameworks are helpful in so much as they provide structure, but they're not like magic. And it's not magic dust you can like put everywhere and then suddenly all makes sense, right? And not all frameworks are useful in all contexts. So I think that like, and I have had a lot of consulting background managers in my life that like use the word framework a ton, and I was not a consulting background person. So that's like my first thought about the word frameworks and what it means generally. I think like underlying your question though is an idea of like, how do you show value to an organization when the things that you're doing don't necessarily cleanly align with like the way that they think about value, right? Because what you're saying is you're saying like customer, I mean, I'm a platform PM now, so this is like a transition I've learned how to make over the last few years, right? Of like, how do you think about that? So I think that's the other question, kind of like underlying all of that. And I would say I haven't figured it out magically, and I don't have a perfect magic answer, but I will say it's like link it to something that does matter to somebody, right? And creating that link. And if it makes people feel better to say that like the structure that you put around that is a framework, you can say like, I made a framework that links how this data infrastructure like eventually provides this value, right? And usually like the way I would say, and is like a picture is always really helpful. What I found when it comes to those sorts of things, which is like, this is dependent on that. And then it unlocks this. And we just did a bunch of big privacy efforts recently that like are taking like 6, 7, 8 months of work. That's not very exciting. But I think it's like for the leads or whatever. But one of the things that we framed it was, if we get here, we unlock this work, and this work is worth XYZ. So you start like changing the make everything in the framing of what they care about, like whatever it is. If this is more about like customer value, because she's like UX research and that's like the background, you can frame it that way, right? And then say like, getting this done will unlock this value and this project that will help this many people or unlock this revenue. I mean, it just depends on the specific use case, but that's the framework I would apply. Right? It's like, what is the thing that they care about? How does the thing you're doing unlock that? And use that language, right? Yeah. Of the thing that they care about to say like, this unblocks that. Because that's one idea that's worked really well for some of the privacy work that we're doing. And and privacy and revenue and growth don't feel completely linked, but we've been able to tell that story.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, because like there's security involved in there too that I haven't even gotten into. Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that Cristina said, like, yes, frameworks are sort of like the structure. And I think it's also along with that is like consistency. Are you using the same stick to measure everything so that you have a consistent, like, and you're not one day I'm using this, the other day I'm using that to measure. And so like, I think your manager might be looking for consistency. So like I loved what Cristina said about like, maybe sitting down and saying, okay, rice doesn't really work in this case. What are the things that you care about? And then develop your own framework. And then because your manager felt like they contributed to this new framework, it's easy for them to sort of understand and digest and sort of like follow along with.
Yeah, that sounds great too.
I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great idea, because it's often in great point, because it's so hard and I've seen this more and more, like the further you get from like the nitty gritty of a project is like, what you're looking for is ways to understand how all the projects relate to each other. Like with that, they're looking for like, how does this project relate to that project? And that's why, like, if you're using revenue, right, it's so easy to just say like, that brings $5, that brings 10, that brings 20. And that's really easy for me to say like, we'll do the one that's 20 because like, right, if everything is equal, because it just like is super, so it is the framework, I think that's exactly the right point. Like you can bring consistency, but you don't have to bring consistency with like an existing framework. You can like create your own structure around it and then like use it to apply and edit it, right? Like over time, like when things don't fit and don't work, you can adjust. It's not, you start somewhere and then you can iterate. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Awesome. Yeah. That's great. This is a very helpful group. Thank you.
Awesome. I actually don't know when we're out of time, Polly, but I don't know if anyone else wants to join and have thoughts. So we still have 26 people watching. And I don't know, Brenna or Tracy, if you have things that you all learned from your blunders as well.
So I think we are actually over time, but maybe we can ask one more question. And then maybe if you can give your final thoughts. So I don't know if somebody's on the screen, if you're interested in asking a question, or I can just go to the chat and sort of pick the next one. Okay, so let me just see what there is in terms of questions. Okay, so I think Tammy here is asking, I also hear Molly's story that her manager might need a framework. So I'm just going to scroll through. So is there a chance to pivot or influence how your manager needs to answer the questions around priorities, trade-offs, and impact? I don't know. Did we answer that question already? Or do you have anything to add to that, Cristina?
I don't think we've answered it directly, but I think the very short answer, since we're over, is yes. That like you can and you should. And I think that like, that's a process. It's not going to happen in one day. You're not going to convince them magically of something else, but you can start to ask questions like, what's important? How do you, why are you focusing on this? Here's what I'm focusing on. Like, why should we not do that? And like, really just like engage. I mean, again, this depends. Some managers I've had, that's been a possible easy conversation, right? And then in some cases that's not. So, but it should be a conversation you should be able to have. Like, how do we measure success as a team? How do we evolve that? Do we need better measurement tools to get to the place where we can make the right links? Because we can't link what we're doing to what you care about. So like, let's invest in that link and closing that loop. I think all of that is something that's worth advocating for. And you can definitely, and the same process I think is valid, right? Formulate your opinion, understand what you're trying to accomplish, get the buy-in at different levels, figure out who you need to talk to, and then share and iterate and get feedback. And I think that like you can do that for like one of the things that my last thoughts, because of some of the things we were having in the one-on-one conversations, are actually that we talked a little bit about reorgs because they came like mostly because that's the example I was using and that's what came up in the chat. But it really could be used in any context. It could be one team changing the focus to a new project, to a new product area. It could be the team changing how they measure, right? Pivoting how you measure and how you measure value to that point. Any of those cases where you need to change a bunch of people's minds and way of doing thing from one thing to another. Whether it's like all that happens on all different scales. It could be a big reorg. It could be on the project level. It could be on the individual level. And all of those, I think, are valid places where you might need to make those pivots.
Cool. Awesome. Before we go away, very important. I know we're all product managers and I know we all want feedback for things, our products, our features and whatnot. So I think Women in Product have done a lovely job putting this together. What they would love is your input and your feedback. So if you see on the top right, just underneath sessions, there's the word Typeform. If you don't mind clicking onto that and just answering a quick survey about this particular event, that would be greatly appreciated. And then I guess the last thing is I want to ask you, Cristina, if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with. And then after that, at the end, people, if you're interested in more networking, you can kind of hop back over to the people section and finishing that off as well. So any last thoughts you'd like to share with us, Cristina? Yeah,
I think like in one of the one-on-ones that I had, we had this really interesting discussion about like the idea of, especially as a product manager, you have a lot of like privileged information, and how do you balance that with like the transparency that you might want to bring to the team? And kind of where I stood, and this is like something that's super important to me personally and that I've struggled with in my career, is like when to give transparency, because that's just so natural to me. and how to do it in an appropriate way. And the takeaway for me was just like, do as much as you can, advocate for the thing that feels comfortable to you, the thing that you think is right. And maybe you don't get 100% there in any given organization, but like that, doing that and advocating for that transparency is like a big focus of the way that I approach like these pivots. And it's just such an important step to building trust and relationships with your team that go beyond where you're working now or beyond the product. And it's just like part of having like a really strong career with really great like partners across all of your cross-functional partners, whoever they might be. So I think that's definitely like the core at the center of it all.
Great. That's an excellent tip. I think transparency it helps bring everyone along. So thank you so much for your time, Cristina. Wonderful presentation. I had a lot of, very, actionable items that I could take away from your talk. So thank you so much for putting it together, and thanks for Women in Product for putting this together. As I mentioned, if you'd like, please leave your feedback under Typeform. Otherwise, hop over to the people section if you'd like to network some more. But otherwise, have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you, folks.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.